joined by Jackson Katz, who's the co-founder of Mentors in Violence Prevention. Now, I do not like reading bios, and so you're not going to get the piece and you're not going to learn where he went to school and all the great, it's in your program, there's great information, but for me, Jackson is really visionary, and he's a great thought thinker and a filmmaker and a speaker and a writer and someone who looks at gender violence prevention education as a key piece of the work that we have to do. That in the work in being a co-founder of the multiracial mixed gender Mentors in Violence Prevention, was one of the first programs to use a bystander violence to be able to prevent gender violence. And that his work has been able to leave a mark for all of us. And I know for me, as I've been involved in this work, I look to Jackson to help challenge us, make us think, and be able to provide a direction that's going to help support the work we're doing. So this is someone who I find very valuable and an important voice, and I'm really pleased that he is able to join us and to speak to all of us here today. Please welcome a big hand to Jackson Katz.
Well, thank you, David, and Sandra, and all of your colleagues at CalCASA for your great work and for inviting me to be part of this special event. And I want to say that Delilah and others' announcement of the partnership with the NFL is very exciting. As you know, and some of you know, my colleagues and I have been working in that space for quite a long time. And just one quick point about working with the NFL. My work and my colleagues' work in professional and college athletics was always about kids and youth sports and high school sports and the role that college and professional athletics plays in helping to shape the norms that affect everybody at the much lower levels. It's never about, oh, we're going to change these professional athletes in a 90-minute session. It's about everybody being part of the process and the power, leveraging the power, the brand, the money, the influence that the professional leagues have, in this case the NFL, in shaping young people's experience, and that's a great and exciting thing. So I'm pleased, very pleased about that announcement. So thank you. As many people have noted, we're gathered in Los Angeles this week at a moment of great progress and great promise for the work that we've been doing, in some cases for many, many years. This is a moment perhaps unlike any other in the history of organized movements against sexual violence. Still, the vast scale and scope of the problem can be overwhelming at times, so it's good to replenish our energy and celebrate our successes and the progress we've made. In the midst of all this, we should never lose sight of the fact that the multiracial, multi-ethnic movements against sexual violence, both here in the States and all over the world, were started in the 1970s by feminist women and a small number of men who supported them, who saw sexual assault advocacy and activism as part of a broader movement for nonviolent social justice. It was never supposed to be limited to the provision of services to victims and survivors or about holding offenders accountable. The radical vision of the early anti-rape activists was to transform the gendered inequalities, institutional practices, and cultural beliefs that gave rise to our society's outrageously high rates of sexual violence in the first place. This wasn't easy work then and now because social change makes people uncomfortable. By definition, it disrupts the status quo. It is unsettling. But if we really want to do transformative work and not simply check boxes in order to meet the requirements of the grant and comply with federal mandates, we need to be willing to step outside the box a little bit and shake things up. As the famous bumper sticker says, well-behaved women don't make history. I might add that neither do well-behaved men. So, in the activist spirit of those pioneers, many of whom are here today, I'm happy to say, I want to take this opportunity to offer some suggestions about what we need to be thinking about going forward and what we need to do. I want to be clear this is not a comprehensive list, and further emphasize that it reflects the kinds of work that I and my colleagues do, particularly on the prevention, social justice, and engaging men's side of the house. The first thing we need to do is we need to honor women's leadership, but then identify these issues as leadership issues from men. When men do this work, it's always important that we honor women's leadership, because while there's a growing movement of men around the world who are speaking out about men's violence against women and children and other men, None of this would be possible were it not for women's leadership across the board. In majority white communities, communities of color, urban, suburban, and rural areas, colleges and universities, high schools, the military, everywhere. At the same time, and many of you have heard me say this for years, we need a whole lot more leadership from men. Men still hold the vast majority of economic, social, and political power in the world. As Valerie Jarrett reminded us yesterday, President Obama and Vice President Biden have been exceptional, but we need a lot more men, especially those in positions of authority and influence, to do more than they've done to date. We need much more. One way to make this happen is to frame it like this. We're not hoping nice guys will help out the women, but rather we expect men who are in positions of leadership in education, religious institutions, sports culture, media, military, business, labor unions, politics, to do whatever they can in their sphere of influence to see to it that victims and survivors are treated with dignity, respect, and care, that offenders are held accountable, and that everyone has a role to play in creating and sustaining a culture in which all forms of gender violence and abuse are totally unacceptable and contrary to societal norms. If men in positions of leadership are not doing this, they're not doing their jobs, and they're not being good leaders in the 21st century. We need to push them to do better and find ways to hold them accountable if they're not ready or willing to step up their game. We need to make gender visible. It pains me to have to say this, but in our messaging and programming, we need to talk openly and honestly about gender and the gender inequality that lies at the heart of the ongoing pandemic of sexual assault. And when I say we need to talk about gender, I'm referring specifically to the need to talk openly and honestly about the fact that sexual violence is committed overwhelmingly by men, young men, and boys. This doesn't mean there aren't female perpetrators and accomplices. Of course there are. And it's important to hold them as accountable as well. But let's not kid ourselves. Whether the victims are female, which they are in approximately 90% of cases, or male, which they are in 10%, the perpetrators are overwhelmingly men. This is a flat-out fact, and saying it is not in any way unfair to men. In fact, I would argue that it's unfair to men not to say this, considering how many men and boys themselves suffer the effects of sexual violence. But the idea that we can achieve true and lasting social change using gender-neutral concepts and language is sheer fantasy. Let me be clear. I understand that many women in the field use gender-neutral language because they know if they tell the truth, they'll be called male bashers or man-haters. I get that. That's the power of the backlash. But gender neutrality is exactly the opposite of what we need. One of the strengths of my program, Mentors in Violence Prevention, MVP, is the honest and lively discussions we always have about gender. I and my colleagues have been working with racially and ethnically diverse groups of men and women for decades, and believe me, men can handle the conversation. This includes men in sports culture and the military, hardly hotbeds of radical feminism. And we don't sugarcoat the issues. Not everyone agrees with everything we say or do, but a lot of men do. A lot of men do. True accountability to the social justice principles that are the foundation of this movement requires that we continue to work hard to be inclusive of the LGBTQ community. Many here have been involved in that struggle for a very long time, as have I and my colleagues, but it's a false assumption that the only way to be gender inclusive is to erase women's reality by pretending we live in a gender-neutral world. We need to be inclusive, but not at the cost of honesty. The most apt analogy is to racism. How many people here think we can have a meaningful national conversation about racism in which nobody talks about race? No honest dialogue, no uncomfortable conversations, just kumbaya, everyone needs to get along. If that sounds silly, then why does anybody think we should even consider having a conversation about gender violence and not talk about gender? I realize there is a lot of pressure on women in the field to depoliticize everything, to not call it men's violence, not get to the heart of the problem. I'm not about to criticize women and you all for this. With my privilege, that would be unfair and illegitimate of me to do. In most cases, women are just doing what's required of them to meet the needs of the victims and survivors that they serve. I appreciate that. The depoliticization I'm talking about permeates our consciousness, however, and it's perpetuated by media coverage, but also sometimes by the very language that those of us in the movement actually use. So people will ask questions like, how many women were raped on college campuses last year, rather than how many men raped women. They'll say, how many girls in the Los Angeles Unified School District were harassed or abused last year, rather than how many boys harassed or abused girls, or how many girls harassed or abused girls. People will ask questions, even in the movement, like how many teenage girls got pregnant last year in the state of California, rather than how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls. In each case, the use of the passive voice has a very powerful political effect. The political effect is the shift in focus off of the more powerful group and onto the less powerful group. This is not a coincidence. It's not sloppy thinking. It's how power works, shifting accountability off of itself. Even the term violence against women is problematic. What's missing? The active agent is missing. Violence against women is a passive construction. It's a bad thing that happens to women, violence against them, but nobody's doing it to them. They're just experiencing it, kind of like the weather, which we don't have much of here in Los Angeles, I'm sorry to say. We need to start using much more direct and honest language. Now, but that being the case, we need more men who are willing to step up and say explicitly that sexual violence is a men's issue, that it's one of the many unfortunate consequences of male dominance, that girls and women are victimized by men's violence, but so are other boys and men. This is not about male biology, it's about how we socialize boys to need power and control in relationships, or how we teach them that they're entitled to women's bodies. It isn't anti-male to say this, it's just a recognition of reality. It's not something genetic or fixed in nature, it's something all of us, women and men, young and old, can do something to change. Another thing we need to do, in the spirit of this United by Purpose conference, one of the themes of this conference speaks to this. So I want to mention one way that we can achieve this goal. As we all know, the sexual assault field is growing, and we have more visibility now than ever, and more institutional and political support, which is all good. At the same time, over the past couple of decades, there's been a growing movement of men across the world, activists, educators, and scholars, who have been doing groundbreaking advocacy and research, inspired by feminist ideas and leadership, that is transforming the way we understand and approach the issue of men's emotional, physical, and sexual health, the rewards and challenges of fatherhood, the effects of trauma. All of this is helping men to lead healthier and happier lives, and as a result, it's having a profoundly positive impact on the women and children around us, including those we love and who love us. One of the most important areas of this work is looking critically at men's violence, specifically what White Ribbon Campaign co-founder Michael Kaufman refers to as the triad of men's violence against women, men's violence against other men, and men's violence against themselves. In other words, most types of violence that men commit, as well as most types of violence they experience, are connected. This is one underappreciated facet of intersectionality. For example, the relationship between violence done to boys in the home and the violence they commit on the streets, the relationship between some men's experience of sexual victimization and their subsequent perpetration, the relationship between men's violence against women and their self-destructive behaviors that too many men engage in. It's all related, as is violence at the micro level of interpersonal relationships and the macro level of the state. But this work isn't just academic or theoretical. Globally, growing numbers of men are looking inward and doing personally transformative work, and then in partnership with women, organizing to change institutional and cultural practices to integrate these new sensibilities in the public world. We've still got a long way to go, but all of this is exciting and hopeful. Yet if you look at many sexual assault prevention initiatives on college campuses and in communities, you'll see there are two parallel universes, the prevention world and men's work. It's almost as if, they're not, there are exceptions, but in general, these two realms need to work together much more closely. The men's health community, the folks who are working to transform the culture of mass incarceration, the healthy fatherhood movement, all of these initiatives can benefit a great deal from the knowledge and expertise of the sexual assault movement, and the movement can learn from them as well. We need to acknowledge the social justice roots of the bystander approach, which brings me to my next discussion. There's a lot of confusion in the general population and also in the field about these terms. Many people hear the word bystander and mistakenly think it's all the same work. It is not. There are different philosophies being employed. I want to provide some background about this and a brief critique about what I see as an unfortunate trend in the field. It starts with the MVP program, which introduced bystander work to the field in the early 1990s. In the early days of MVP, we were developing a program that would initially train college male student athletes in gender violence prevention. We wanted to develop a pedagogical model that could provide critical information and refute common rape myths, but do so in a way that would, in the words of Futures Without Violence founder Esther Solar, invite men into the conversation, not indict them as potential rapists or abusers. We quickly realized that the bystander category offered a way to transcend the limitations of the perpetrator-victim binary, which up until that point had held sway in conventional gender violence prevention theory and practice. In many educational programs developed in the 1970s and 80s, women were regarded primarily as victims, potential victims, or empowered survivors, and men as perps or potential perps. This approach wasn't very effective because guess what? Then and now, most men don't see themselves as perps or potential perps, so if you talk to them like that, they shut you out. Most men think, hey, I'm a good guy, this isn't my problem, you need to talk to those guys, you know, it's not my issue. But the bystander category offered us a way to address those men. The goal was to get men who did not abuse women to speak out and make it clear to the guys around them that if they're abusive to women, they wouldn't just get in trouble with the authorities, they would lose status in their peer culture, on their hall, on their team, in their fraternity, in their community, in their workplace, with their friends. We addressed everything from guys talking smack about women and telling sexist jokes to gang rape and everything in between. Of course, part of the teaching was that if you saw a friend or somebody around you abusing someone, of course you had to do something. You couldn't just sit there or turn away. But at its heart, the bystander approach that we pioneered at MVP and practice to this day is a social justice approach, because the core message is that if you're in a position to interrupt the enactment of an illegitimate privilege, and you don't, if you remain silent in the face of racism, heterosexism, or sexism, your silence is a form of consent and complicity. Ultimately, the goal of this approach is not only to stop individual incidents, it is to change social norms. Somewhere around 10 years ago, the term bystander intervention appeared, and what came with it was a shift in the field away from the social justice foundation and toward more of what I like to call a glorified bouncer type of approach. The idea was that bystanders needed to intervene at the point of attack. If you're at a party and you see a situation developing, you need to rush over and stop it. Now, let me be clear. Of course we want people to intervene safely and smartly when they see bad things happening. We've taught this in MVP for 22 years, okay? But the bystander approach is not merely a public safety strategy. It's a way to change social norms, to get young men and women and older men and women and others to have honest conversations about their responsibilities to each other and to themselves. Here is my plea. We're at this incredible moment of possibility in the work to prevent sexual assault and transform the social norms that perpetuate the problem. Let's not miss the opportunity with prevention tactics that barely scratch the surface. By all means, let's do bystander work, but let's do it as part of a broader educational strategy that incorporates honest discussions about social justice, gender norms, and leadership in all levels of society. We don't want simply to give people options for intervention, regardless of how critical that is. We want to help them grow into people who acknowledge and embrace their responsibility to change the beliefs and behaviors that help to perpetuate gender inequality and all forms of abuse, locally, nationally, and globally. I have one more piece in this sort of catalog of suggestions. I appreciate your bearing with. It's like a TED Talk, I have to tell you. It's like a TED, because the clock is, you know, inexorably moving forward. That's how TED Talks go, you know? You got to just talk fast, and I'm sorry for those who aren't used to the fast talking. But you know what? We need to talk about porn and its effects on rape culture. For many of us who work in the sexual assault prevention field, pornography has long been the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Few people even want to acknowledge it, much less criticize and deconstruct it. In countless sexual assault prevention workshops and presentations, we talk freely about the sexual objectification of women in media and how this helps to desensitize men to women's core humanity. When you reduce someone to an object, it becomes easier to dismiss them, mistreat them, and ultimately to violate their bodily integrity. We have no problem talking about all this when it comes to advertising, Hollywood films, music videos, but when it comes to porn, we hardly even bring it up. Meanwhile, right down the street from here, a soulless multi-billion-dollar industry with disturbingly close financial ties to respectable multinational corporations continues to crank out thousands of videos annually that feature some of the most dehumanizing and degrading acts ever captured on film. In the mainstream of the porn industry, the gonzo porn that is marketed to heterosexual men features videos in which scene after scene depicts men or a group of men aggressively taunting and ridiculing women even as they penetrate them mercilessly with little regard for the women's bodily health and no regard for their sexual pleasure. And because of the internet, boys have access to this material at the tender age of 10 or 11. Before they've even kissed a girl, millions of young boys have watched videos online of men ejaculating onto women's faces as they call them cum-guzzling whores who got what they deserved. Pornography is by far the leading source of sex education and sex miseducation in our society and in the world. It is simply absurd to think it has no effect on boys and men's sexuality or their attitudes about women and their own sexuality. The reason many people in the sexual assault prevention world don't want to talk about this boils down to this. No one wants to be accused of being anti-sex. This is especially true of people who work with college students. No one wants to be seen as uncool or uptight. And admittedly, there are nuances to this debate and differences of opinion among people who are otherwise in total agreement about the topic of gender and sexual equality and the goal of nonviolent social change. But by and large, the sounds of silence prevail. There is no way to do justice to the complexities of this issue in this space and time. But let me just say, the sexual assault prevention field needs to be having more in-depth conversations about pornography. We need to integrate discussions about the effects of porn into every level of our educational programming. Some people in this room have found ways to do this, and I applaud them, but we've got to do a whole lot more. And let me add that I completely reject the idea that being critical of the deeply misogynist porn industry is anti-sex in any way. That's a piece of self-serving propaganda from the porn industry. Those of us who believe in a liberatory human sexuality need to take back the narrative and state that when the porn industry inundates the sexuality and psyches of millions of boys and young men with depictions of men sexually disrespecting and degrading girls and women, and the women love it and ask for more, that does not in any way advance the cause of sexual freedom for women, men, or anyone else. In fact, it has set it back by decades. Finally, I just want to say one thing about the political year coming up. Here we are in an incredible political year. Over the years, I've heard that many people say we can't politicize the issues of sexual assault and domestic violence. We need people across the political spectrum as allies and champions. It's certainly true that we need to build diverse coalitions for action, absolutely. But the idea that we need to keep politics out of this is absurd. These issues are totally political. They have always been and they always will be. A budget is a moral document. What we focus on, what we fund, what we place as a priority is a political question. The funding for sexual assault programs, the priorities that are placed on it at the state level, at the federal level, at the local level, is all about politics. We can't pretend that these aren't political issues. And I would give you one piece of last piece of unsolicited advice. We have a political year unlike no other, with social media, with all this incredible attention. We need to be starting to hold candidates accountable at every level for what they're going to do when they take office. What are they going to do to use their platform of influence and the incredible power that they have, both budgetary power but also the bully pulpit, as it were? What are they going to do to make the world a better and a safer place? What are they going to do to speak out about men's violence against women and children? And let's get specific. Let's ask them and push the media to ask them questions at press conferences. Why did you vote against the Violence Against Women Act? How do you present yourself as a leader in this country and you're not supporting efforts to address one of the biggest problems that we have in our society and the world? Ask them that. Hold their feet to the fire. We can do that in this movement. I love the idea that you have offices in D.C. right now. We need to be right at the heart of power and hold people accountable, especially men. And any man who presents himself as a leader in our society at this time in history, who doesn't talk openly and directly about how he will use his leadership to speak out about men's violence against women and leverage the power that he has, should be booed off the stage. Good luck to you, and thank you very much.